The Titanic was the most modern ocean liner ever built up to its time. It was the pride of the shipbuilding industry and a marvel of engineering and construction capability. Note the man standing at the bottom right. The ship was gigantic and was designed with so much built-in redundancy and buoyancy that it was for all practical considerations unsinkable. The world was shocked, therefore, when this marvel of ingenuity sank on its maiden voyage. Humanity had been riding high on a great crest of cultural optimism that came with the rise of an industrial revolution that promised to have no limit. It seemed unbelievable against this background when the news circulated to the world in 1912 that the impossible had happened, that the Titanic had sank, that it was history, that it lay broken on the bottom of the sea. But was it really an accident like it is being remembered? The pages of history tell us that shortly before midnight on the 14th of April 1912, 4 days into its maiden voyage, the much heralded unsinkable ship had struck an iceberg that had injured the ship so severely that it could no longer remain afloat. We are told that the Titanic sank in the early hours of April 15, 1912, 2 hours and 40 minutes after its collision with the iceberg. The sinking resulted in the deaths of 1,517 people of the 2,223 people on board. This makes it one of the deadliest maritime disasters in history outside of war. The high casualty rate was due in part to the fact that although complying with maritime regulations of the time, the ship did not carry enough lifeboats for everyone aboard. We are told that the ship had a lifeboat capacity for only 1,178 people, while its onboard capacity was 3,547. However, it is generally admitted that the ship was constructed to carry 64 lifeboats, 4 for each of its 16 davits, for a total capacity of 4,000. It is being omitted that the operator of the ship had decided to carry only 16 lifeboats, plus 4 collapsible boats with canvas sides, instead of the 64 it was designed to carry. The lacking lifeboat was therefore by choice, not by design. Also, a disproportionate number of the men aboard the Titanic went down with the ship, as women and children were given priority. Some people are now suggesting that this too was arranged for a specific reason. Among the many men who went to their icy grave with the Titanic were 3 of the wealthiest men of America, patriots of the entrepreneurial class of the New Age. They were men who might have prevented the making of the far greater tragedy for the world that followed the sinking of the Titanic, had they lived to do so. It has been suggested in later years, long after the sinking of the Titanic had happened, that the sinking of it had been arranged in order to eliminate these 3 critical men from the political horizon who seemed committed to prevent the foreign takeover of America's economic lifeblood, its currency, by the London-centered banking empire that was being set up to happen at this time. One of the 3 men that went down with the ship was John Astor, the famous hotel developer of the Astoria chain and captain of many industries. He was the wealthiest man in the world at that time. The second man was the famous Benjamin Guggenheim, one of the greatest American industrialists. The third was Isidor Straus, the owner of Macy's department stores. These men were patriotic Americans with great personal resources who, as it is being said, would have blocked the sellout of America and the plans for war that were already in the making that America had been planned to be drawn into. The masters of empire evidently knew who in America had the means, the influence, and the commitment to stand in the way of their taking over the country. Thus the masters developed a solution to clear the slate. It is interesting to note that J.P. Morgan, who had contracted the building of the Titanic, had been scheduled to be on the maiden voyage, but had cancelled. Some people point to the timing and suggest that the great Titanic was sunk for an incomparably greater imperative, the gaining control of the economic lifeblood of America. The stakes in that game were enormously huge. The three men who could have blocked this had to die, though without a backlash being unleashed by it. The project required an act so unbelievable that no link would ever be inferred. Indeed, how else would the masters of empire be able to kill three of the biggest names in the American capitalist world, who were known to be opposed to their plan, and to accomplish this without raising any eyebrows? Who in this case would tie the sinking of a brand new ship, and an unsinkable ship at that, to an assassination plot against just three of its passengers? That's insane, right? That's unbelievable, isn't it? This is probably why it was done. The ship itself was a pittance as an asset in the overall scheme. It was no doubt fully insured, or even over-insured. It probably wasn't a huge feat either to invite the three targeted men separately onto the maiden voyage of the greatest ocean liner ever built, which the Titanic was at the time, especially considering that it was declared to be unsinkable, promising a safe journey where nothing could go wrong. Also, it probably wasn't difficult either for an experienced mariner to ram the ship into an iceberg at full speed in the middle of a moonless night so that it would sink, and to assure in the hubbub that the targeted victims would not get anywhere near to the few lifeboats that the ship carried, much less into them. It is being suggested that the captain must have been a party to the plot. The captain was a seasoned mariner. He knew the sea well. He had sailed those waters for 26 years. He was no fool. But he was also a Jesuit, a soldier of God, and as a soldier he would die if this was deemed necessary by God. He might have been seeing himself as a warrior serving in the war of his God against the Protestant abomination that he might have been told that the ship was, as the Titanic had been built in a Protestant city, by Protestant workers. The captain might have been inspired to carry out a mission that had been commanded by God himself. It is known that the captain received his priest's personal blessing on the eve before the departure. The Jesuits would have been compliant with the planned project to sink the ship in order to oblige the financial masters of empire who were holding the key to the wealth of the church. The captain might have been inspired to see the task before him as a critical one, arranged for him alone, from the highest level, from God, whom no one can refuse. That is probably the reason why the project unfolded with such flawless professional precision as it did. Evidently, the captain knew what he was doing when he drove the fastest ship afloat at full speed in a moonless light into an ice-infested stretch of sea, almost blindfolded. Only a fool would commit such a reckless, insane act, or a dedicated soldier on a mission. The captain had hands-on experience at the helm of great ships for close to 4 decades by then. He understood the dangers that icebergs pose and knew well where to expect them. Except this time he didn't fear the danger, he went for it. It was success that, in later years, in retrospect, by drawing all the threads together, that nothing else makes any sense. It appears that the game was planned with such an airtight precision that a hint had to be inserted into the plan that would unmistakably demonstrate to anyone who would see through the facade of the plot and be tempted to stand in the way of empire in the future, that resistance is futile. For this, the sinking of the Titanic was timed to occur on the anniversary day of the assassination of President Lincoln, almost to the hour. The Titanic and President Lincoln were both mortally wounded shortly before midnight on April the 14th, and both died the next morning. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln was one of the last major events of the American Civil War. The war had ended on April the 9th, 1865, when the Confederate forces, the forces of empire, had been defeated on the battlefield, by which the war was shifted to a higher level. Lincoln, who had resisted the goals of empire, was assassinated 5 days after the American victory was won, as if to say, even then, resistance is futile. The goal that the American Civil War had been intended for was reached in the year following the sinking of the Titanic. The Federal Reserve Act became law. It was designed to achieve the same goal for the masters of empire that the Civil War had been launched for. The Federal Reserve Act that gave control of the nation's money into the hands of empire was rammed through on December the 23rd, 1913. It appears that the bill was rushed through the system in order that the congressmen and senators wouldn't be held back any longer from getting home for Christmas. These kinds of pressure tactics are not uncommon in modern times. Evidently, the president at the time, Woodrow Wilson, stood in full support of the Empire's bill that had originally been concocted in private meetings in one of the mansions owned by the agents of empire. Those who suspect that the timing of the sinking of the Titanic tells a significant story are probably more aware of the mode of operation of the masters of empire than most people are. This general lack of awareness is probably the reasons why these kinds of games against the common aims of mankind and for the welfare of an imperial financial oligarchy are still being run as vigorously as ever, in which the traitors are being hailed. When President McKinley was murdered in 1901, the plot to sink the nation was already unfolding. The Republican Party boss Thomas Collier Platt had forced Theodore Roosevelt, a loyal empire man, onto McKinley as a running mate in the 1900 election. This was done against the wishes of McKinley's manager, Senator Mark Hanna. Theodore Roosevelt served as vice president from March to September, when McKinley was killed by a hired assassin. With the president murdered, Theodore Roosevelt became the president as planned. If the timing of these events tell us a significant story, then the enacting of the Federal Reserve System into law that handed the welfare of the nation into the hands of private banks makes the 3 assassinations on the Titanic and the collateral deaths of 1,514 people a relatively minor affair in comparison, as the masters would have seen it. As the 3 men who died with the Titanic might have sensed, the eyes of the masters of empire had been on America as a whole, as the long-standing enemy of empire since the nation had claimed its freedom from it. The assassination of McKinley in 1901 paved the way to the gradual sinking of America. So it was that as soon as the ink was dry on the Federal Reserve Act, the act was followed up with the Income Tax Act that provided the means to pay for the Federal Reserve's profits. And as one might expect, it was Woodrow Wilson who signed the act into law, who was later also the man who brought the USA into World War I in defense of empire, nicely arranged on the basis of lies and deceptions. Emboldened by their victory in America, the masters of empire prepared the stage for World War I to begin, that exploded in the very next year after the Federal Reserve Act had become law. A decade and a half down the road, the USA lay bankrupted on its knees, entering the worst depression in its history. A kind of economic ice age began, as it were. Today, the Federal Reserve Act still operates, and the depression it has enabled cuts now deeper than ever. 2 world wars have passed, and a Cold War that still lingers on to some degree, and still the Titanic as the process sails on. So it was that the old song of the Titanic, "Resistance is futile," continues to be the tune to the present day, while the trail of the corpses of the assassinated victims keeps on getting longer. The Titanic song, "Resistance is futile," was interrupted only once. This occurred during the years of President Franklin Roosevelt. It became a brief holiday-type interlude that remains largely but a distant memory. Does anyone even remember FDR's face and his policies? Few do. On the day that FDR was laid in the grave, America's economic ice age was renewed. Even FDR's Glass-Steagall legislation that had prohibited the banks from looting America in order that America could live again, by which it became the greatest power in the world, has been repealed. Franklin Roosevelt's face has been forgotten, his policies have been trashed, The old imperial Ice Age world has been brought back. America has allowed everything to be trashed that it had built during its holiday in the sun. Of course, this was so by design, but it doesn't end there. The real Titanic struggle by empire had a far wider focus than merely bringing America to its knees. The wider focus had been to destroy the Titan that the empire fears the most, which is humanity itself. The naming of the ship that played a brief role in the long war of empire against humanity might have been chosen so as to hint at the ultimate objective of empire, which is to defeat humanity as a whole, the Titan, by any means with which this can be accomplished, always proclaiming along the way, resistance is futile, while in reality such resistance would be liberating, assuring freedom from the devastating impact of the empire of oligarchy. Until humanity's freedom from empire is won, the Titanic continues. The most critical phase has just begun. The long-expected astrophysical ice age lies ahead in uncharted waters. The modern Titanic flies into it, recklessly, by intention. The ice age ahead stands as a barrier that empire cannot pass. And so, for as long as humanity remains latched to the system of empire and flies with its imperatives, it will collapse with the reality of the coming ice age that has already started, and it will go down to its grave with the ship. To date, no lifeboats have been provided to secure humanity and civilization. Not a single one. In 1912, the Titanic was infinitely better equipped than we are today. While in 1912, the Titanic hadn't been provisioned with the 64 lifeboats the ship had been designed to carry, which would have been amply sufficient to secure the life of everyone on board. The 1912 ship did nevertheless carry 20 lifeboats, while modern humanity, for its journey across the vastly more dangerous seas of the ice ages, hasn't provided itself a single lifeboat, not one. While it cannot be determined whether an actual conspiracy stood behind the sinking of the Titanic in 1912, all the elements exist for a grand conspiracy to have stood behind the Titanic disaster, because the elements all do tightly mesh. Thus, it is extremely likely that the Titanic disaster has been planned and intentionally carried out. It is equally as likely that a disaster that humanity is presently rushing towards has been planned by the same oligarchy of empire and is presently being executed with the same type of intention, though for an infinitely more devastating outcome. With the entire world now being chained to the modern imperial Titanic, on a journey without lifeboats headlong into the Pleistocene Sea of the Ice Ages, it is extremely unlikely that anyone will survive on the present course. It is highly probable that the disastrous outcome is intended. It is in the nature of empire for this to be intended. The entire system of empire exists by conspiracies. It is a citadel built on conspiracies, since no natural universal principle supports empire as a legitimate element of civilization. Empire exists by conspiracies. Conspiracies are its heart and soul. Empire conspires to commit looting, slavery and war by which it exists. Conspiracies are its hallmarks, the hallmarks of great crime. Still, congratulations are in order for the masters of empire. Almost no resistance is offered in the modern world against the march of empire. Its march has destroyed many nations, and now threatens civilization and humanity as a whole, while the world stands silent, bowing in submission, patiently accepting its imposed fate. With its scientific and productive capability, humanity does have the power to direct its destiny, regardless of what the Ice Age brings with it. The power exists. It is real. We have the power for the first time in human history to snap an Ice Age. But will we choose to utilize this power and live? This is the critical question. Right now the answer is uncertain. Humanity is tightly chained to the system of empire by its own choice, by which it is doomed.